Kia ora tātou. Greetings everyone. Welcome to the actual audience in the room, and we've got about 60 people online as well. So welcome to all of those. Tonight, dealing to the impacts of climate change. We don't need reminders too much about the impacts when we see Auckland underwater yet again. And the principles of managed retreat is what we're particularly going to focus on. Delighted to have tonight Emeritus Professor Jonathan Boston, who's been doing a lot of work, and some of you will have looked at his very detailed report on the issues, and also Climate Change Minister James Shaw. Welcome to both of you. Delighted to have you here. Thank you. The format tonight, Jonathan's going to kick off with a presentation and outline a number of the issues. James Shaw will respond. There may be something of a conversation between the two of them, and then there'll be time for some questions from the floor. But James, I think you've got to be away at 7, is that correct? You can be flexible. Great. Excellent. Okay, over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you. Just say one of the advantages of a politician is that they can flex. Sorry. Well, kia ora, everyone. It's great to be here. It's wonderful to have such a large audience, and I'm going to try and make sure this microphone works. Now, you're probably here to hear what James is going to say rather than me, so I'm going to be as quick and as sharp as I possibly can be, leaving plenty of time for James and then for questions and discussion. So the context of this event is pretty clear. We've had some very significant, damaging, severe weather events over the last year all over New Zealand, including Cyclone Gabrielle, and we're now in the process of trying to deal with the recovery from some of those very damaging events. And there's a process underway which obviously James is involved in, which will involve, among other things, the purchase of some properties that are at such high risk that they should not be lived in the future. And how that matter is resolved is quite significant. Secondly, there is an expert working group formed by the Ministry for the Environment operating right now to advise the government on managed retreat. And I'm a member of that group, and I'm not speaking tonight on behalf of the group, I'm speaking as an individual, though obviously what I'm going to say will be informed by the discussions we've had over the last 8 or 9 months or so. The group is chaired by Sir Terence Arnold, the former Supreme Court judge. Prior to that, it was actually chaired by Dame Sian Elias, the former Chief Justice. In addition, the Environmental Defence Society has launched a project on climate change adaptation, and there are a growing number of documents online through EDS. I wrote a long report, which Philip has mentioned. In addition, there's a working paper, the first working paper, and the second working paper is just about to come out. The second one is on legal issues, the first was on funding issues. All right, so that's the sort of context, and I'm hoping that this might work. Did I go too far? Yes, I did. How do we go back? That way. Okay, so let me make some general key points to start with. First of all, climate change is a long problem, or a long-term problem. It poses unprecedented governance and policy challenges, not least the need to relocate large numbers of people globally and locally in the face of increased flooding and inundation from sea level rise. Proactive managed retreat, that is in advance of being flooded out or inundated, will be essential if we are to minimize the long-term societal costs of adaptation. And I'll say more about that in a moment. For multiple reasons, both proactive and post-event, that's post-disaster managed retreat, will require substantial central government funding for new physical and social infrastructure, and also to compensate for the loss of private property, especially housing. And I'm going to say more about the need for a public compensation scheme for that purpose in a moment. An effective policy framework will need new public powers, probably in a new Climate Change Adaptation Act, which the Ministry for the Environment is working on at the moment, along with discrete planning processes, a public compensation scheme some sort of public insurance scheme, and new institutional arrangements. And if I could just make this final general point, which is that the funding of managed retreat over the long term need not mimic the response of the government to the most recent extreme weather events. In other words, whatever compensation package the government comes up with over the next few months, that doesn't need to set a precedent for the future. It might, if governments continue to say this is going to set a precedent, but it need not. And in fact, I think it probably should not. All right, so you all know we've experienced significant damaging events, and there's a lot more to come. And some of you may have been affected in one way or another, or maybe your relatives have been. That's Wairoa a few months ago, and this could be Wellington by the end of the century, with a metre of sea level rise, which will have devastating effects on the central business district. So if you think managed retreat is just going to be a simple walk in the park, removing a few beach cottages, think again. The consequences and the implications are enormously severe, unprecedented, and if we think decarbonising the global economy is challenging, I think adaptation is going to be vastly more challenging, and it's going to be even more challenging if we fail to decarbonise rapidly. What's at stake globally? The IPCC, for example, point down here, has estimated that the value of global assets that will be at risk in 2100 at between 7.9 trillion US and 14.2 trillion. That's in 2011 values, and that's in 2100, which is only 77 years away, the lifetime of a few people in this audience. Flooding costs by 2100 are estimated at between 14 trillion and 27 trillion in another estimate, and you can look at the reference if you wish. So we're talking really big numbers. Even if we manage to avoid meter sea level rise, we're talking big numbers. And locally also very big numbers. Even now, before we have significant sea level rise or significant vertical land movement, something in the vicinity of 675,000 people are at risk of a 1 in 100 year flood event, with an estimated value of around $135 billion in 2016 dollar terms. And for every 10 centimetre of sea level rise, it's estimated that that will put at risk an extra 7,000 buildings, 133 kilometres of roads and 10 kilometres of railway lines, at significant inconvenience and public cost. And if we have half a metre of sea level rise, obviously much more significant impacts. If we have a metre of sea level rise, it would expose buildings to coastal inundation valued currently at around 25 billion. And those, I think, are probably modest estimates. So, managed retreat is going to be essential. We simply won't be able to protect significant numbers of coastal communities. It will simply be either technically impossible and or too costly. So we need to move people, and ideally we need to move as many people as possible preemptively before they get flooded out, and certainly before they get flooded out 3 or 4 times in the space of a few years. Why will it be cheaper? Well, it will be cheaper, at least from a society's point of view, because we won't have all the wretched damage to contend with, as well as moving people, and we can do it in a more planned way. But this imposes really, really significant governance and policy issues. And among the key questions which need to be debated are whether, when, where, and how should people be relocated, and who decides? Should it be a ministerial decision at the central government level, or a local government decision, or some combination? Who should pay? In other words, what are the principles that should inform funding decisions, and who should pay for what, when, where, and why? How can people be persuaded to move proactively and voluntarily? It's often difficult to get people to move after a disaster, let alone preemptively. I remember talking to the person who had overseen the movement of 8,000 properties, 20,000 people in Christchurch in the red zone, and he said to me last year, he said, well, Jonathan, it was hard enough to move people in Christchurch after a series of disasters. It's going to be incredibly difficult to do this proactively. So this is going to be an enormously challenging political problem all over the country and all over the world. And globally, there are no well-established sort of highly effective governance frameworks and institutional mechanisms in place yet for managed retreat, and especially proactive managed retreat. And I'm sorry that the microphone seems to be causing no end of problems. So let me move on quickly. What are the costs and so forth that are going to arise? Well, there's going to be property loss, significant amounts. There's going to have to be the costs associated with demolition and removal of structures in Christchurch. Removing 8,000 properties cost in the vicinity of $1 billion. We'll have to have new housing to replace the old housing, new infrastructure to replace the old infrastructure. There are going to be really significant insurance issues, which I haven't got time to go into. We'll have to have post-retreat land management, and of course, we'll need to seek to protect cultural heritage wherever possible and protect ecological values. So, what should be the goals of overall adaptation funding framework? I've listed some of them here, that you can add a few more if you wish. But the key goals, in my view, are that we should seek to minimize societal costs of adaptation by reducing climate change risk exposure, thereby lowering damages and insurance costs. And that means acting proactively, as I've said. And I've emphasized societal costs here, not just fiscal costs. We need to think about this as from a societal point of view, not just from a governmental point of view. If we do the latter, we will make some very foolish decisions. Secondly, we need to share the burdens of this incredible adjustment process equitably, both intergenerationally and intragenerationally. And in my view, for reasons I'll come to in a moment, this will require a fair compensation scheme for property losses. We also need to ensure that people have access to safe, healthy, affordable housing. We need to have a durable, consistent, and predictable approach with minimal delays and minimal transaction costs, so people can get on with their lives, which was a key objective of the Canterbury earthquake arrangements. And we need to ensure that there is adequate insurance cover for people during the process of managed retreat. We need to minimize moral hazard, ensure transparency, and of course exercise fiscal prudence in all this. And I just wanted to note here, these are the objectives that the former national-led government agreed to that should guide the compensation arrangements for the red zone. And notice the first two here: certainty of outcome for property owners as soon as practicable, create confidence for property owners to move forward. And we've heard quite a lot about that just in the last few months, haven't we, as a result of what's happened in Auckland, Hawke's Bay, Tairāwhiti, and so on. So really, really important, in my view, that we have a framework that provides a degree of certainty, avoids long delays, and enables people to get on with their lives. Otherwise, the psychological, economic, and social costs of all this are going to be even greater. Okay, why have a public compensation scheme? Multiple reasons. So let me just quickly run through them. The first is that will be consistent with long-standing traditions of community responsibility, social solidarity, and collective risk pooling in this country. Think EQC, think ACC. Secondly, I think it would be absolutely essential in order to honour the principles and provisions of Te Tiriti, because lots of Māori land, marae, other cultural valuable cultural sites and so on are going to be at risk, serious risk. Thirdly, we need to ensure that everyone is housed. Housing is really critical in this, because the loss of housing is going to be at the really pointy end of all this. We need to ensure that socioeconomic inequalities are not exacerbated, and we need to minimize hardship. I might say that the Cabinet has repeatedly agreed on the principle of hardship, but hasn't yet identified what it actually means, James. But anyway, we'll worry about that another time. Fourthly, we need to adhere to long-standing legal precedents regarding the physical taking of private property, which have involved the provision of compensation. Think Public Works Act. We need, fifthly, to recognise the absence of alternative forms of redress. There's no way New Zealanders are going to get money out of ExxonMobil or BP or Shell around the world for the damage that sea level rise, etc., will cause. We need to recognise the need to secure a social licence, particularly for voluntary relocation. We don't want a situation in which state authorities are constantly dragging people out of their homes under some sort of compulsory mandate. We need also to recognise the risk of higher long-term societal costs if there is no public compensation. If people are told they're not going to be compensated for the loss of their property, what are they going to do? They're going to demand protection. And we'll end up with ever bigger, more expensive, ridiculously risky protective regimes because people aren't being compensated for the loss of property. Now, I'm not going to go through this because I haven't got time, but there are various arguments against providing any form of public compensation, and I think they're all wrong. We can come back to we can come back to that if anybody's interested. But I do cover it in depth in my report for EDS, which Philip mentioned. Okay, if we're to have a public compensation scheme, and I'll be brief about this, there are a whole variety of key sort of policy issues that need to be addressed. And they include the scope, eligibility criteria, level of compensation, form of compensation, whether we should pre-fund the scheme as we're doing to some extent with for retirement pensions, the Cullen Fund, whether there should be bespoke arrangements for iwi hapu, and what sort of institutional arrangements should we have. And in my view, there's no right answers to those sorts of questions. There are many options, and they all have significant disadvantages, unfortunately. But we do need to learn the lessons of the past and the lessons of other jurisdictions, and there are some really interesting and important lessons there. And above all, we need a workable and durable scheme, and that implies the need for multi-party support. Which means we need the kind of agreement we've had, fortunately, on EQC and ACC over many years. All right, let me just make a few quick comments about some of those really key design issues. First of all, scope. Among other things, we're going to have to decide whether or not we only compensate people for the loss of sort of land and buildings, or whether we compensate people also for what can be called regulatory takings, where we say, well, actually, you can't use your land for this purpose anymore. And that's a really critical issue that goes well beyond actually managed retreat. It goes into the heartlands of what we're going to do about intensive dairying in parts of the country. Are we going to pay farmers to stop using their land in particular ways or not? There's a question of to what extent we should compensate for land and buildings, or just perhaps for buildings, houses, for example. There's the question of what we do about disruption to business, because there'll be lots of it, and what we do about damage to agricultural land, as we've witnessed in recent months. It's going to be a big issue in parts of the country. Eligibility. Who should be eligible for assistance? Now, here I think we can make a useful distinction between residential and non-residential properties on the basis that ensuring that everyone is housed is a really fundamental principle, basic human right. Whereas ensuring that everyone can run a business is not necessarily quite so precious. On the other hand, businesses matter for all manner of reasons, so we can't just ignore the impacts of sea level rise on business. But I do think we can make a useful distinction. And I also think we can make a useful distinction, as I indicate in the report I did for EDS, between different types of residential property. For example, we could say we're going to be willing to provide more compensation for principal places of residence than, for example, perhaps for tenanted properties, and a lot more for those sorts of properties than for holiday batches. You might want to say, actually, we won't provide any compensation for holiday batches other than removal and demolition expenses. I'll be very brief, I'm almost there. Levels of compensation, that obviously matters. There's all manner of ways in which we could design a scheme for compensating people in terms of how much people get. My personal feeling would be we're going to have to put caps on. Even for principal places of residence, if it's a multi-million-dollar, beautiful house on the coast, it's no longer going to be viable because it's at high risk. I'm not sure that New Zealanders are going to wear paying, $10 million or something to the owners. I could see people wearing a proposition in which we provide compensation for most people, maybe up to, say, the 80th percentile in terms of buildings and so on. I'm in favour of a pre-funded scheme on the basis that this generation, I'm not speaking about the young people in the audience, but the older ones in the audience, we have contributed to the problem that the younger people at the back of the room are going to have to deal with. And I think there's a really good sort of philosophical basis in terms of polluter pays for people like you and I paying towards the cost that people in the future will have to bear. I won't go through all this other than to say we need to design a compensation scheme very, very carefully and with really rigorous public debate, because it needs to have as much public support as possible. And among many other things, we need to recognise that there's a lot of first home buyers out there who have very large mortgages. And if we're not generous enough, people are going to be left in significant debt, in fact, probably go bankrupt. And again, I'm not sure how and to what extent New Zealanders will be willing to have lots and lots of people going bankrupt as a result of having an insufficiently generous scheme of compensation for principal places of residence. All right, so that's more or less me. Let me just sum up. We've got a really significant challenge of managed retreat ahead of us this century and beyond. We don't know the precise speed of sea level rise. We don't know exactly where the big storms are going to impact, but there's no question we are going to have to move thousands, probably tens of thousands of people out of harm's way this century, and maybe, sadly, hundreds of thousands in coming centuries. Managed retreat will be inevitable and unprecedented in the challenges it imposes. And I really just, if you don't remember anything from this session, just the word unprecedented. This is going to be exceptionally difficult, even with artificial intelligence. Super intelligent artificial intelligence, I might say. Okay, we need a policy framework that's fit for purpose, widely supported and durable, and the potential for government failure is very high. All right. Over to you, James.
Any questions? Good evening. Good evening, Wellington. Thank you for having me. This is the first time I've been to a Fabians event, and I'm delighted to see that the Venn diagram between the Fabians and active Green Party membership is high. So hello. It's lovely to see virtually everybody I know again. So I don't have a sort of a direct response to anything that Jonathan has said, except that I agree with virtually all of it. And the work that he is doing and others doing at the moment is informing where we're landing in terms of the policy response. In a great irony, much of that policy response is being waylaid by the need to respond to some extreme weather events and flooding in the northern half of the North Island. That's interesting in two ways, one of which is for people like me who like irony, kind of taking a perverse delight in saying I told you so, but also just actually kind of getting some very real and live examples to have to work through. Having said that, want to reinforce something that Jonathan said, which is managed retreat is something that you do before an event rather than afterwards. That's disaster recovery. Having said that, there are things in the disaster recovery response that are similar to where we're kind of landing in terms of the way forward. And one thing I am pleased about, I have to say, is that the government's disaster recovery response in Tairāwhiti and Hawke's Bay and Tamaki Makaurau and Northland are people are actually actively thinking through kind of starting as we mean to continue. So like an attempt to try and have that response look as similar to what a proactive response will look like when we get around to having a proactive response, which if we can stop having all these storms in the meantime, we might get to. Note, indeed. So there are a couple of things that I just wanted to add, though. One of them is that managed retreat is not the only response. There are kind of four general categories of response, one of which is to do nothing. And in some cases, that is an entirely valid thing to do. So the kind of facetious example that I use is if you want to put a barbecue area down on a beach, you can afford to lose the barbecue area. It's sort of no big deal if that asset becomes unusable. If you're trying to build a new airport, first of all, have a think about that. But second of all, you might not want to stick it on a beach, right? You might want to go to higher ground. So there is, doing nothing and just allowing this to occur is actually valid in some places. It does have costs and it does have consequences, but that is a valid option. The second one is to accommodate what is happening. So in Queensland, which has had some astonishing floods in recent times, part of the response there has been to lift some of those houses onto 2-metre poles. So they're just literally putting those houses on stilts, recognising they want to stay in place. These floods will happen, and as long as you're sufficiently high up, that water will carry on under you and drain out. We've actually done something similar in the Edgecombe area. Remember after the floods a few years ago there, they had some horrendous floods. That is a floodplain. It's a former wetland. And so it will continue to flood, but they want to continue to live there and they want to continue to farm there. So what the response was literally just to create 2-metre pads, and either to move the houses up onto those pads or to build new houses on those pads. So if you drive across there towards Whakatane now, as you drive through that farmland, you'll see that there are houses all sitting on these sort of raised daises. So that's our response, to simply accommodate the changes that you think are likely to occur. Again, there are costs and there are consequences, but that is a response. A third response is to go for a defensive strategy, which is one of the favourites in this country, I have to say, and that's seawalls, flood defences, levees, dams, dikes, and all of that kind of stuff. And that is also appropriate in some places. It also has costs and consequences. Exhibit A, New Orleans. When you build enough of these things high enough and then you have an event that exceeds the tolerance, it fills up like a bathtub. Much of the damage in Hawke's Bay was caused by stop banks bursting open when the pressures built up behind them, caused largely by silt and I'm just going to say woody material building up against the bridges, you know, those sort of wonderful bridges with their quite narrow things, which kind of essentially acted like a series of beaver dams. So then water would build up behind it and blow out the side of the stop bank and instantly flood the entire valley, and that happened in a number of different valleys in the Hawke's Bay. So there are costs and consequences of taking that approach as well. And then the fourth option is to leave and go somewhere else. So the trick for me, I think, is to actually actively choose which of those or what mix of those makes sense. What of those is going to be the most effective and the most cost effective in any given location. And that is one of the reasons why I think decision making has to be as localized as possible, because no two examples are going to be the same. But I do think that we need to be very clear-eyed about it. You want to say, well, if I've got $1 to spend across those four options, which is the one that makes the most sense, and then deploy that. And what that means is it's in most cases not just a property by property decision. It is a community decision about this street or this coastline or this river valley, or some sort of contiguous area where multiple properties have been affected. And again, the Cyclone Hale and Cyclone Gabrielle have been instructive in this. So in Auckland, in sort of Muriwai, you see the kind of the erosion on the cliffs. In sort of Te Atatu and Grey Lynn and other parts of Auckland City, you'll see half a dozen properties in an area where there happens to be a bit of a dip or a gully, in which maybe 3 or 4 of those 6 houses will be red stickered and totally destroyed because they're at the bottom of the gully. Another 3 or 4 will be kind of more marginal, perhaps yellow stickered, and you can make choices, but you end up with it's going to be difficult if 3 of the red stickered houses, 2 of them decide to leave and 1 of them decides to stay. How do you manage things like drainage and all of that kind of jazz? And there have been examples here as well in Haimoana, in the Hawke's Bay before all of this happened, where there's a particularly erosion-prone coastline. There are 19 properties had to go through a process of deciding what they were going to do, and they settled on the one that the government would pay for, which is another thing we're going to have to talk about, which was a seawall. And then 2 of those properties have since decided to withdraw from that. So how do you have a seawall with 17 out of 19 properties? Right? You don't. So the whole thing tips over. So you need a process for local and community decision making, but one that's sticks, and then having made the decision, you have to then move to executing that decision, because you can't then spend the next 10 years relitigating it and so on. So it's going to have some kind of legislative impact, but I still think it has to be locally led. And to the point about who's going to pay for it, yes, whilst central government will get involved, the cost is effectively going to have to be shared in some way between the property owner themselves, their insurance company, their bank, their local authority and central government, in a way that makes the most sense and, as Jonathan said, doesn't create moral hazard, i.e. encouraging people to continue to make the kind of dumb decisions that people clearly make. So, such as when you're colonising a new country, build all of your towns and cities on river plains and floodplains. So, which is kind of how broadly speaking we got to where we got to this time. So, so then having decided on which of the options, you then have to then move to a process of executing on that. And as Jonathan said, I think to do so as fast and as efficiently as you can, because people need that sort of certainty. Now, the advantage of managed retreat, of doing it proactively, is that there's no obvious time limit that you're up against. So you can afford to take a bit of time to do a proper job of it. In a post-event, assuming that there isn't a major disaster whilst you're in the middle of making up your mind, where we are, of course, with Cyclone Gabrielle and Cyclone Hale, is that those are post-event decisions, and so you've actually got people who are already displaced, thousands of them actually, who need some very immediate certainty about, can I rebuild my house? Am I going to have to move? Where do I get the money to pay for the difference between the value of my house and the rebuild? And all of those kinds of questions need to be resolved very, very quickly. And so the process around that decision-making thing will probably be a bit blunter than it would be in a managed retreat situation, where you have the ability to be a little bit more subtle about stuff. And I will say about the insurance, markets, is that, in my opinion, they're actually starting to do exactly what they are supposed to do, which is to assess risk and then to price it. And part of this will be driven by the fact that in some places around the country, premiums are, well, they're already starting to go up in some places, and they will get very, very steep as this gets further advanced and more sophisticated. And so I think people will respond to that. But one of the ways that they will respond to that is by withdrawing from the insurance system entirely and then being uninsured in some of the highest risk places in the country. And that then creates a real problem where, we kind of all end up carrying all of that cost, and those will probably be some of the most vulnerable communities in the whole country. So it's a wicked problem and set of problems. In fact, in a cabinet committee, I shouldn't be really talking about what's said in cabinet committee, but anyway, one of my colleagues did say that in their opinion that this is probably the single most complex public policy challenge that you can imagine, from quite a long list of really quite complex public policy challenges that we have to face. At which point another of my colleagues said, "Thank God a Green Minister's looking after it for us." So it's a doozy, but we should have over the course of the coming months a little bit more clarity about where we're landing on some of the kind of key challenges that Jonathan has posted here. So thanks very much for being here and for engaging in this. God save the King.
Well, if I could just very quickly respond to a couple of things that James said, most of which I agree with. First point, though, where I probably would part company, I think that when it comes to a compensatory regime for the loss of private property, bearing in mind all the issues around scope, eligibility and so on, but we will need some kind of compensation, the central government is probably going to have to be the primary funder. Yes, if we have caps, then obviously private citizens will be taking a loss. If in some cases the compensation doesn't cover the mortgage, well then there will be issues for banks. But we can't have large numbers of that. It just won't work. So I think a scheme that is going to be workable and durable will have to have the central government as the primary, as the anchor funder of compensation. Secondly, on insurance, just quickly, and I know this will be controversial, but I suspect we will have to move to compulsory insurance for natural hazards. I think the issues are going to be so difficult otherwise, as James has just indicated, because we'll run into that problem of lots of people not being able to get insurance, and then what? And a lot of the people who can't get insurance are really poor, which is one of the reasons they can't afford to pay additional premiums and so on. So I think we'll probably have to have some kind of subsidised public insurance, at least for natural hazards. And the truth is, we've probably got it now, which a lot of people don't realise. So EQC can now provide you with direct EQ cover if you can't get it from a private insurer. Five properties in the country are currently covered in that way. I don't know, because I haven't asked them, to what extent it's subsidised. But I suspect if they can't get it from private insurers, and they can get it from EQC, it is in effect subsidised. So that option exists right now, and I think we're going to have to probably expand that out in sensible ways with proper criteria and so on, but it's probably going to have to be compulsory, which means we won't have the problem of uninsured properties. Everything will be insured, and for people who can't afford very much, it will have to be a fairly large subsidy. So that's probably enough from me. Well, it's a levy. Sure. But in this case, it might have to be a much greater subsidy, in effect. We should let you answer questions from the floor.
Any questions? Yes.
Roger Blakely. So, well, thanks for the presentation. It's fantastic to see the progress you've made. My question is to James on talking about decision making at the lowest possible level, as well as looking at the compensation scheme. Are you looking at models of decision making to do that? And particularly the Clifton to Tangoya and the Hawke's Bay process, which was very much a community-led process to try and get those difficult choices being made at the lowest possible level. Are you looking at that, and will that be reported on?
Yes, we are. And in fact, the Hawke's Bay example is probably one of the best in the country. There were a couple of important things that were missing from it, one of which was an understanding of who was going to pay for the implementation of the decision, which is why it ended up on the most expensive option. And it's easier to make that decision if you assume that somebody else is going to pick up 100% of the tab. So one of the things I think is going to be necessary for this is, really good participatory democracy process like they had, well facilitated by the local council, really good data about, kind of the state of things and the potential future states of things, and also what is essentially the cost-benefit ratio of each of the options that are in front of you, and a very clear understanding of where that money is coming from and not coming from. And I think if you have those things present, then you will have much better decision making, because then people will, I think, make some harder decisions, including things like, well, actually, probably the best thing for us to do is just not be here. Which is probably the hardest single decision to make, but in a lot of cases is the most rational decision to make.
Just to say, I walked along that coastline in front of I couldn't walk in front of some of the properties because the sea was in the way, just a couple of months ago, James. And look, even if they could be protected in the short term, in the long run, they're dead in the water, literally. I mean, and it would be ridiculous to build a seawall, in my view, in that particular locality. And the reason, of course, many of the residents want a seawall is that currently there is no compensation if they lose their property. So as soon as we have an adequate, well-agreed, multi-party arranged deal on compensation, which people will see they can't change by voting another government in, all right, then we will have more rational decisions being taken, in my view.
Thank you. That was a very interesting talk. Just a couple of comments. Chirikawachi, who grew up in New Zealand, did work on the tsunami in Japan. And one of the things that was very clear is that if people moved as a street, as a neighbourhood, that they lived longer, and there was very shortened lifespans if they were individually scattered. So I think that idea that the community has to make a decision, that they also shift and can take that community with them. My other brief comment was to you, Jonathan, in terms of Christchurch and the lessons you've learned from that.
Yes.
In that great book that people did in Christchurch called Once in a Lifetime, we wrote a chapter called, not that ours was great, but the book was great because they all did it voluntarily, looking at the inverse care law that occurred in terms of housing. So you talk about homeowners, but the renters were in a terrible position in Christchurch.
Sure.
And a lot of the disabled people, for example, lived in rental properties in the inner city,
Yes.
and we tracked them through the primary health organisations, and they were all scattered. So
Yep.
I don't think we should just be thinking about financial capital. We should be thinking about human capital.
Oh, look, thank you, Philippa. Absolutely, and I'm sorry, I had limited time, so I wanted to concentrate particularly on residential properties and the compensation for them. But yes, absolutely, we need to think about tenants. There's going to be lots and lots of tenants who are going to be affected, lots and lots of people of limited means and disabled people, elderly people, and so on. If you think about South Dunedin as a suburb, 40% of the properties, something like 3,300 properties in South Dunedin, residential properties, around 40% are rented. And that's one of the most vulnerable areas in the next sort of 50 years in terms of flooding and inundation from rising sea levels. And we're going to have to think really, really carefully about, well, this is your responsibility, Philippa, given you're on the board of Kangora. How are we going to ensure that we provide really good quality social housing so that people can move into in the context of proactive retreat?
The Treasury has to provide, the government has to provide income-related rents, otherwise we can't.
Anyway.
What I was thinking of, we have in the past been encouraged to build on cliffs near waterways. Not just because we liked it, but ironically, if you look at the ecological side and the economical side, banks encouraged you because you probably paid higher mortgages. Society was encouraging you because environmentally it was pleasurable. Councils got more rates from you, and et cetera, et cetera. So therefore, we have progressively been pushing people into places. Now it's going to cost them, and if they can't afford it under the insurance, whatever compensation scheme, then it's going to cost society. So it's now, I think, we're looking at mitigation factors, but also, like you say, we've got to look at what we're doing so intergenerationally our grandchildren don't carry the can. So looking at public, private and government, how does all that fit? How can they work together to make this work?
Oh, I'd encourage you to read Jonathan's 200-page report on exactly that question. Look at, yeah.
There is an executive summary.
So that is actually the nub of the entire thing, right? And so when Jonathan's talking about things like in any kind of compensatory scheme, are there caps and at what level, and and so on and so forth. And you're right. Look, we're not going to pay out $12 million for some multimillionaire's property just because it's got a nice view. One of the things I'm quite fascinated about in Auckland is actually, if you look at the property values of the clifftop properties that have been damaged versus the ones that are on floodplains and covered over creeks and so on, there's quite a stark contrast. Rich people live at the top of cliffs so they can have a nice view. Poor people live in gullies and in places where water collects. Rich people have better lawyers, and I think it'll be fascinating to see how many seawalls get built versus how many, where the resources flow. as a result of all of this. So that's another dimension that we need to kind of manage for this here.
But James, there's a footnote on that, which is that it's going to be absolutely critical. And I'm sorry, I didn't have time to say all the things that are critical. But one of the things that's critical is we're going to have legislation which prevents buildings occurring in high risk areas or being further extended in high risk areas. Because at the moment we have this ridiculous situation which you're referring to, which is that councils in some cases are still encouraging development or responding to the vigorous pleas and money of developers, still encouraging development in areas that are clearly going to be vulnerable to sea level rise. And we've just got to stop that. I mean, that's one of the things that just has to stop almost straight away in order to reduce the costs for future generations. Good luck, yes, that's right.
Jonathan James, Portholich. The union movement for a very long time has run up the concept of a just transition. I think this fits a just transition, and I think the most important thing about it is to look at the social insurance ideas, which you can then move to areas of dealing with climate change and the managed retreat. And I think the quicker you get onto it, keep it simple and put up ideas that fit with what New Zealand's done in the past, then I think that is the beginning of that conversation that will lead to things in the future. And I think that that whole thing of public good and about basically what they've done in New Zealand for generations, which is they've privatised the gains and socialised the losses. And I think this is a classic example of return to some form of compulsory insurance in these areas, because if you don't, it will be a lot harder in the future when the crisis comes.
Yes, and I think the framing of just transition is highly poignant and relevant, as it is for decarbonisation. It's a pity that MB's taken 5 years to do very little.
Just make sure that you put your hand up nice and high so that Philip can see it.
A question for Jonathan. He mentioned earlier about paying farmers to stop farming in certain places. I'm just wondering, are you anticipating using what will actually be an adaptation, a form of adaptation in order to actually mitigate emissions and reduce the risks of climate change happening in the first place? If so, is that possibly a way forward, or is it cheating?
Look, this is a question I'd love James to answer, so I'll be very brief. But just to say, in the past, we have invested, if you want to put it that way, or we have subsidised changes to land use in the interest of protecting valuable ecological areas, like Taupo, for example. An agreement reached which involved significant public funding to essentially reduce the intensity of stocking in the catchment of the lake. Now, some people think that's an anathema. It's kind of socializing. It's socializing the costs that these farmers and others have inflicted on the environment. Well, I mean, my view humbly would be, if that's the only way we can affect the kind of changes we need to protect the environment, then I'm happy to contribute to the cost.
Yeah, there's a number of different categories there, right? So one of which is that you could end up in a situation where you're paying for land use change on an adaptation basis, right, in order to stop hillsides falling into the rivers and into the seas. And that's, the best way to do that is to plant biodiverse, long-term permanent forests, right, with complex root systems that are better at holding up hillsides. Those kind of places that we should never have cut down in the first place. So that will have a impact on our net emissions, because the more of those trees we plant and so on, that'll soak up the forest. But actually, the primary reason for doing it is actually a defensive one when it comes to dealing with the effects of climate change. So that is certainly something that's possible. There's also the notion of supporting biodiversity credits and incentives, that kind of thing, which is kind of gaining some traction. And then, yes, there's kind of what I would just describe as buying emissions reductions and removals, which we do at the moment through the emissions trading scheme in pretty blunt force kind of a way. But that could be more sophisticated as well. And then there is a Venn diagram between those three things, right? So I think you need to be very clear-eyed about what tool you want for what outcome. That's important. But ideally, you also want tools that achieve multiple outcomes too.
Thanks for this really interesting conversation. Sorry, Isabella. I'm thinking about the status quo of local government in New Zealand, and the funding systems mounted, the responsibilities between central and local are all a bit out of whack. The democracy in local government, I think, you alluded to rich people having lots of lawyers, and in some respects you could say we've got a bit too much democracy in local government at the moment, or not the right kinds, but also the need for really good participatory democracy at a local level. We don't have enough of that going on. I think about some of the big reforms that are trying to go through, like Three Waters, and I wonder, do you think there's a way to pull together some of this sort of almost constitutional reform of how we do local and central government and how we involve people? Is there kind of a golden thread through this, that these really confronting images of people's homes falling into the sea might help us crack it for once?
God, I would like to think so. I agree. I think, frankly, there is a kind of an abusive relationship between central and local government. I think it's terrible that the way that central government treats local government, that we continuously mandate responsibilities and then don't provide any tools to be able to do that, with unsurprising results, which is that they get it wrong, which reduces the trust that central government has in local government, and that kind of cycle just keeps on rolling. There may be an opportunity here to try and kind of rethink some of that and walk backwards on some of that, but I don't, to be honest with you, hold out a lot of hope. I guess what I am hoping for is a system that does, brings in participatory democracy, does provide local government with some tools, does get really clear what the delineation and interrelationship is between central and local government and the property owner and the bank and the other kind of key stakeholders. But I'm not going to try and constitutionally reform local government whilst we're dealing with what is already a complex challenge. But it is something that I desperately would like to see happen.
Just a quick two comments. The first is, one of the challenges we've got, in addition to the ones that James has mentioned, is that from the point of view of climate change adaptation, we've got quite a number of very small, vulnerable, resource-poor territorial authorities with lots of at-risk properties. Westport in the Buller district is a classic example. Wairoa would be another example. If we were to move Westport later this century in the face of sea level rise and flooding of the Buller River and so on, there's no way the Buller District Council, or even probably the whole West Coast, could really manage that itself. It will need a lot of, leaving aside the money, it will need a lot of technical help from outside with planning and so forth. So that's just one issue we need to recognise. We may have to have a flexible planning regime which involves different levels of decision making depending on the capabilities of the local governments. That's going to be a complex issue and a controversial one. The second quick point would be this. As we move into a period of human history where there will be ever more severe impacts and where there will be ever more emergency declarations and ever more recovery packages and so on, I guess my fear is that we're going to have an ever-increasing centralisation, certainly in a country like New Zealand, of decision-making. And if we fail to put in place the kind of policy frameworks that we need to build resilience and to ensure we adapt in advance of the oncoming tide and so on, then the risk is we end up with just ever-increasing centralisation and potentially an increasing loss of confidence in democracy, with democracy at risk. And given all the other threats to democracy, super-intelligent artificial intelligence, Donald Trump and all the rest, we've got a lot to cope with.
I thought you'd never hear the words super intelligent, artificial intelligence, and Donald Trump in the same sentence, but there you go. Yeah, somewhere on that spectrum.
Okay. Kia ora. We've been talking about this assuming a fairly constant population, but we probably looking at maybe quite large numbers of climate refugees, particularly from the Pacific, and I was just actually wondering if you have any comments to make in relation to this about that. Thank you.
No, you go for a second.
Okay. Well, I mean, actually, if even without that, if you look at our population growth over the last century, we're one of the fastest growing populations in the world, actually, in terms of developed economies. Anyway, a quarter of the people who live in this country today were not born in this country, so that's kind of a significant trend. I mean, when I was born, there were 3 million people. Now there's 5.5. So you can work out for yourself how long that was. But so that kind of has to get factored in anyway. Now we have been doing quite a lot of work in and around issues of forced migration due to climate change in the Pacific. One of the things that we're extremely sensitive to is that nobody wants to move. Why would they? They want to live in their homes and remain there with dignity, and they don't want to have a plan B, right? They want plan A, right? They're betting on plan A. So, all of the work that we have around our emissions reduction and our nationally determined contribution and our climate finance commitment, all of that kind of stuff is built around plan A. But we also know that the reality is that given the thresholds that we're currently meeting, there is a high probability that you will see some migration. The first wave of that is actually likely to be within countries, right? So one of the programs that we've got going in Fiji is we're essentially paying for the relocation of 42 villages in Fiji away from the coast and further into the uplands. By the way, Fiji has a really good model for all of this managed retreat stuff. So they've kind of worked out the split of responsibilities. They've worked out, they've 90% of the community has to agree, but at that point it locks and it's got legal force and the decision gets executed, all of that kind of stuff. So, and they've made loads of mistakes too. So they've arrived at this, as we all do, through a bit of trial and error. But they've kind of worked it out. So they're doing that within countries. There are other countries for whom that's not possible, given that the high water mark, the highest point in the country is a metre above sea level at the moment. Then you will see movement between the islands, and you're starting to see a wee bit of that at the moment, not heaps, but a wee bit of that. And then you will see migration towards Australia and New Zealand. And we need to work out what the receiving environment is for that. Iwi need to be leading that conversation, or a leading part of that conversation. And there is also a question that we've got to get our heads around, and we're starting to get our heads around, about how do you maintain a culture and a language and a state in the absence of territory. And that question has actually been answered through history, but we don't have very many modern precedents for it. So we've kind of got to work out all of those things. So you can understand taking this one nice and carefully.
Just a couple of very quick comments. James, great that you mentioned Fiji, because it's set a precedent here in having a well-developed framework for moving actually hundreds and hundreds of I wasn't aware we were going to fund 40 of them, but 400 so villages, as I understand it, have been identified for potential relocation over the coming decades. There's quite a long, thoughtful document online if people are interested. Second quick comment is simply, I think the issues of migration, let's leave New Zealand to one side, the issues of climate-induced migration are going to be phenomenally difficult for the world. They already are. They're going to get ever more difficult. Tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people are going to be displaced. over the rest of the century and into the early part of next century, and potentially many, many hundreds in the next century. And it's just going to be diabolical, because we know displacement is politically disruptive, creating internal tensions, international tensions, and so on. And many of the areas where displacement will occur are already challenging areas from a governance point of view.
Just time for one or two more questions. We've got one at the back.
There's one at the front.
We'll go up here. You try one, two, three.
Kia ora tātou, Ellen Blake. Great talk, very interesting, lots of big issues, but really good to hear about Fiji doing something. I'm just wondering what's the time frame for New Zealand, because, grandchildren coming on and stuff, we haven't got time to muck around, but it just sounds like we are talking. It's a political one.
Time frame?
I guess one of my great disappointments in government is that we spend a lot of time stroking our chins and not making decisions. But we are aiming to have legislation in the House before the election. It certainly won't be passed, but having said that, as I alluded to at the beginning, the great irony is that the cyclones themselves have disrupted quite a lot of that work program, so that's a bit touch and go, but we'll see what we can do. The other thing is that the adaptation legislation that we're introducing is only actually quite a small part of the whole picture of what needs to occur. So there are things going on all over the place which are part of the adaptation work program. And I'll give you a few examples. In 2017, we released coastal hazard guidance for local councils. We're currently beefing that up. The Stop Building in Dumb Places rule is one that David Parker has in his remit as Minister for the Environment, because that's in relation to the Resource Management Act system, and there are decisions that Cabinet's making shortly around some of those kinds of choices. The replacements to the Resource Management Act, this Spatial Planning Act and the Natural and Built Environments Act and the National Planning Framework that sits under those, are where a lot of these decisions will be made, because they're about forward planning. It's a lot of it's about spatial planning and so on. So those sort of kind of decisions on where to build next and where we're going, if we're going to do land swaps or anything like that, that will be happening in those sort of locations, in those parts of the framework. The amendment to the Local Government Official Information Act that's going through Parliament at the moment contains within it a mandatory hazard risk reporting on land information memorandums, on LIMS. So that will become compulsory for councils to put that information into LIMS.
Is that
funded? No, it's not. But a limit does only cost a few $100s. The key part of it is, if someone's selling their house for $1 million, that is a bit of a rounding error. But the thing that's missing is the data, and that needs to be made available, right? So, so there's all of that. So one of the things I just want to kind of, guard against is the idea that the climate change adaptation bill will kind of answer all of these questions. It won't. It's just in relation to some specific parts to do with that decision making about where you've got development that already exists, that was built under previous planning regimes, that we know is at risk. What is the process by which you go about making those choices about how the response is and how do we pay for it? That's essentially the bit of the jigsaw puzzle that particular act will address.
Thank you. Last couple of questions. Do you have one?
Thank you so much. Yes, I think I have some minutes. Yeah. About the share, you mentioned share burdens, and because you say that lack of data, and I concern about the quality of data and how can we share the burdens? How can we evaluate to share the burdens equally? Yeah.
There are multiple issues here. I really only talked about the challenge of compensating for residential property loss in the context of managed retreat. But there's going to be the cost of the loss of business, the loss of non-governmental organisation properties. For example, I visited the Hohepa property, which near Clive, thank you, a few months ago, which until recently was accommodating something like 50 very seriously disabled people in a very vulnerable area, which was flooded, but in a way that actually didn't damage the buildings, thankfully. And they're in the process of moving to higher ground in another part of the Hawke's Bay, but there's no funding for that kind of thing at the moment. So there's that, the non-governmental organisations, there's social infrastructure, schools, hospitals and so on, which in most cases the central government will have to fund and so on. For each of these different types of cost, we will have to think carefully about what the principles are that should govern who should pay. And it will be a different answer depending, in my view, on the specific type of loss or cost that's going to be that's going to have to be met. Are you from Vietnam? Yes. Well, I knew there was somebody from Vietnam here, and just to say that if you want something really scary, look at some of the sea level projections for the Mekong Delta over the next 50, 100 years. And it is positively scary because it basically, even if we were to stabilize at 1.5, we look likely to lose most of the delta area, which is one of the rice bowls of Asia and the world. Millions and millions of people displaced. It's really terrible. I mean, what our generation have contributed to in terms of the impacts of climate change is absolutely reprehensible and abominable. I'm sorry, and I'm part of the problem.
Last question, Ruth.
Thanks very much, both of you. Really enjoyed that discussion. Just leave you with a question, a thought, really. And it relates to the running out of time problem. When you run out of time, it gives extra leverage to people who want to hold out. And that is an inherent problem with this whole area. And it happens in a number of areas, and I'm sure you've seen some of it, but one of the real difficulties is finding incentive mechanisms or bribe mechanisms to deal with the holdout problem. And I just wonder, where you've gone in terms of thinking, are you, for example, thinking if a community, gets to 90% agreement, but there's 10% holding out, how much pressure do you put on that remaining 10%, or do you provide a central government bribe, or is it a local government bribe, and so on and so on, or do you just regulate? So what's the sort of structure of your thinking in that area? I know it's a bit complex, but yeah.
Well, there's no area of this that isn't complex, so why not throw another log on the fire? So there are a number of different issues there, right? So one is, one of your options is to say, well, actually, no, you can stay there, but utility companies and local authorities have no obligation to provide you with any services, right? So good luck. And also, by the way, the insurance companies are under no obligation to continue to insure you, which means that your bank is under no obligation to continue with your mortgage, etc. So go for it. And as I understand, there are actually people still living in the red zone in Christchurch on that basis, right? Not very many, but they've made their choice. They're going to stick it out, and they collect all their own water and they make all their own electricity and so on and so forth.
But not with a rising tide.
No, that's right. So this is the caveat, which is when that thing inevitably floods or whatever have you, do we just say, well, we're also not going to provide you with emergency services to extract you from that location? Well, we can't actually do that on a humanitarian basis, but that then becomes a cost on society. So there may well have to be a level of compulsion in there somewhere, but I think the idea is that you kind of want to exhaust the voluntary options first. The other real doozy in this is if the post-event compensation or support is better than the pre-event support, then why would I move if I know that my house is going to get wiped out and I'll get fully paid out, right? So there's a trick. to try and work that out. Because at the moment, again, and if you look at the Hawke's Bay and everything that we're doing up there, because we don't have a framework in place, we're going to end up carrying an enormous amount of the cost because we haven't worked out how to distribute that cost prior to it happening.
Or you could have a step-down arrangement for compensation.
Yes, you could. So yes, it's complex. But those are the kinds of considerations that they're kind of working their way through.
And the problem is James and the government don't have time to put in place a sophisticated program in the next few months. So it's going to be, as James said, somewhat blunt, which is why I think we mustn't have that as a precedent for the future. We need to develop a fit-for-purpose compensatory regime, funding regime more generally for adaptation that is going to be durable, that is going to be seen to be equitable, that has multi-party support, and it may well be different for the very reasons you're hinting at, because we don't want a regime which is going to, in effect, incentivize people to stay.
Thank you, Rich.
It's an incredibly huge issue. Thank you very much, James and Jonathan. Been a tremendous evening. And thanks, everyone. Thank you indeed.